They were not wives, they were not prostitutes, they occupied a space far more cruel than either. Byzantine imperial concubines existed in a legal and social void, designed to extract maximum utility from their bodies, while denying them every protection afforded to either married women or even registered sex workers. They could be discarded without divorce proceedings, killed without murder charges, and their children, imperial blood flowing through common veins, faced fates more horrific than orphanhood. This was not accident, it was architecture. The woman who would later be recorded only as Concubine 12 in palace ledgers stood in the underground chamber of the Bocolion Palace on a January night in 1042. She was 17 years old, her dark hair still loose in the style of unmarried girls despite what was about to occur. The chamber walls were bare stone, cold enough that her breath misted in the lamplight, and the air carried the smell of damp earth mixed with something acrid herbs burned to prevent conception, though their efficacy was more superstition than medicine. She had been a baker's daughter 3 weeks earlier. Now she wore silk so fine it was nearly transparent, and gold cuffs encircled her wrists, beautiful restraints that marked her new status. Property, not slave, which would have granted certain legal protections under Byzantine law. Not wife, which would have offered security and social position. She was something else entirely, something the empire had spent centuries perfecting, a woman who legally did not exist beyond her function. The eunuch who had escorted her withdrew without meeting her eyes. The heavy door closed with a sound like a tomb ceiling, and in the silence that followed, she understood what her mother had tried to warn her about before palace guards had taken her. What happened to girls who caught an emperor's attention? What followed was worse than any future she had imagined for herself. The Byzantine Empire did not kidnap its concubines randomly. The process was methodical, efficient, and supported by elaborate bureaucratic infrastructure that tracked thousands of girls across the empire's territories. Palace officials called them scouts, eunuchs, who traveled throughout the provinces with explicit instructions to identify girls of specific physical characteristics, ages, and social backgrounds. Records from the reign of Constantine VIII describe the criteria in chilling detail. Girls between 13 and 18 years old, daughters of artisans or merchants wealthy enough to be well-fed, but not influential enough to resist imperial interest, possessing beauty that met strict standards defined in written protocols. When a suitable girl was identified, scouts would approach the family with an offer framed as honor. Your daughter has been selected for imperial service. Refusal was technically permitted, but families who declined faced sudden tax investigations, revoked business licenses, or accusations of crimes that somehow always ended in property confiscation. The choice was illusion. The outcome was predetermined. Anna Komnene, writing in the 12th century, described witnessing such a harvest. They took the silk merchant's daughter at dawn, while her mother wept and her father stood silent, knowing that resistance meant their destruction. The girl was 14. She looked back once as they led her away. Her face held the blank shock of livestock selected for slaughter. Once identified, girls were transported to Constantinople in covered wagons that travelled only at night. They entered the palace complex through underground tunnels that connected directly to the concubine quarters, ensuring that neither their arrival nor their existence would be visible to the thousands who lived unworked in the palace above. They disappeared into the earth, into a system designed to consume them completely. The numbers were staggering. Palace records from a single 10-year period during the reign of Romanos III document 847 girls brought to the imperial concubine quarters. Of those, only 39 survived long enough to be released or transferred to other arrangements. The rest simply vanished from historical record. No death certificates, no burial records, no trace beyond their initial entry into the ledgers. What happened to them in those underground chambers was even more calculated. The concubine quarters occupied the deepest levels of the Bocolion Palace, 3 stories below ground, accessible only through guarded stairwells that descended into lamplight and perpetual dampness. Archaeologists excavating the site in 1927 discovered a labyrinth of small cells, each approximately 8 feet square, carved directly into bedrock. The walls bore no decoration. No windows existed at this depth. Ventilation came through narrow shafts that also served to pipe down sounds from the palace above a deliberate design that allowed concubines to hear court life. They would never be permitted to enter while ensuring their own voices could never carry upward. Each cell contained a narrow stone sleeping platform, a chamber pot, and iron rings set into the walls at intervals that suggested restraint rather than decoration. Later excavations uncovered stains in the stone. Chemical analysis in 2011 confirmed human blood concentrated around those iron rings and the sleeping platforms. But the physical architecture was only part of the system. The psychological architecture was far more sophisticated. Girls arriving in the quarters had their names confiscated immediately. Eunuch overseers assigned the numbers based on arrival order 12, 27, 43. These numbers were branded onto their left shoulders using heated copper implements, the scars deliberately prominent to ensure permanent identification even if they somehow escaped. Their hair was cut short in a style that marked them instantly as concubines to anyone in the palace who might see them during their brief movements between cells and the bathing chambers. They were forbidden to speak, except when directly questioned, forbidden to make eye contact with anyone except their eunuch handlers, forbidden to possess any personal items, write letters, or maintain contact with their former families, who had no legal standing to inquire about their daughters' fates. The empire had created a category of women who legally did not exist, who could not testify in court, could not own property, could not enter into contracts, could not even be recorded as having died because they had never been officially documented as living within the palace complex. They were ghosts, breathing shadows kept in stone cells beneath an empire that proclaimed itself the guardian of Christian civilization, and the purpose of their existence was brutally specific. Imperial concubines served 3 primary functions, each carefully delineated in palace protocols that treated women as multi-purpose tools. First, sexual availability without the complications of marriage. Emperors could summon concubines at will, use their bodies for hours or minutes, then dismiss them back to their cells without any of the diplomatic considerations that governed relations with an empress. No family alliances to maintain, no political consequences to navigate, just bodies kept perpetually available in the chambers below, accessible whenever desire or boredom struck. Palace records mentioned the bell system, a network of cords connected to bells in the concubine quarters that would ring in specific patterns, indicating which numbered girl was summoned. When her bell rang, she had precisely 10 minutes to wash, dress in the designated silk garment left in her cell, and present herself at the chamber door. Arriving late resulted in whipping. Arriving in clothing deemed insufficiently appealing resulted in denial of food rations. Resisting summons resulted in consequences. The records describe only as corrective measures applied until compliance was achieved. The encounters themselves were documented in ledgers maintained by eunuch observers who recorded dates, durations, and whether the concubine displayed appropriate gratitude and enthusiasm. Girls who failed to perform convincing pleasure faced subsequent training sessions in which they were instructed in the precise sounds, expressions, and movements expected of them. Those who continued to fail simply vanished from the records. But that was not the worst part. The second function transformed women into livestock. While empresses provided legitimate heirs, concubines served as insurance backup wombs that could produce children with imperial blood without the political complications of legitimate succession. The calculus was coldly practical. If an empress proved infertile or produced only daughters, concubine children could be legitimized through imperial decree. If succession was secure, concubine children could be disposed of without legal consequences. The breeding program followed precise protocols. Palace physicians tracked concubines' fertility cycles through forced physical examinations conducted monthly. When a woman was deemed optimally fertile, she would be summoned nightly until conception occurred. Pregnancy was monitored obsessively, weekly examinations, controlled diets, restricted movement to prevent miscarriage. And when birth occurred, the child was immediately removed. No maternal bonding was permitted. The infant would be examined by physicians who assessed its health, physical perfection, and gender. Male children in good health were sent to be raised by selected families in distant provinces. Potential future emperors kept in reserve, their mothers' identities never revealed to them. Female children were sent to convents where they lived as perpetual novices, their imperial blood ensuring they could never be married off to create rival claims to the throne. Infants deemed imperfect, those with any physical deformity, illness, or perceived weakness, were killed immediately. The method varied, but palace medical texts describe suffocation as standard practice, quick and leaving no marks that might raise questions if bodies were discovered. The mothers received no information about their children's fates. After birth, they were returned to their cells to recover, then placed back in the availability rotation within 6 weeks, regardless of their physical condition. A woman might bear 4 or 5 children during her years in the concubine quarters, and never know if any had survived beyond their first hours of life. Records from the reign of Michael IV document one woman, Concubine 19, who bore 7 children over 9 years. Palace ledgers note that she repeatedly asked eunuch handlers about her children's fates, behavior deemed inappropriate and suggesting insufficient gratitude for imperial favor. After her 7th birth, her number disappears from the records entirely. She would have been 24 years old. What happened next was even more calculated. The third function was the darkest. Concubines served as test subjects for imperial concerns, ranging from poison detection to medical experimentation. Byzantine emperors lived in perpetual fear of assassination. Poisoning was the preferred method, subtle, deniable, difficult to trace, so the palace developed a system of protection that used concubine bodies as shields. Every meal prepared for the emperor was first fed to a concubine selected from the quarters. She would eat a full portion while palace officials observed. If she showed any signs of illness within 2 hours, vomiting, convulsions, difficulty breathing, unusual sweating, the meal was discarded and the kitchen staff interrogated. If she survived without symptoms, the food was deemed safe for imperial consumption. The concubine, having served her function, would be returned to her cell. No treatment was provided if she had ingested poison. She simply died in the stone chamber below, while court life continued undisturbed above. Palace ledgers record these deaths with clinical brevity. Number 23 expired following meal service. Replacement requested from provincial scouts. Over a single decade during Basil III's reign, records document 97 concubines who died during food testing protocols. 97 women whose bodies absorbed poisons intended for an emperor who would never know their numbers, never see their faces, never acknowledge their existence beyond requisitioning replacements when the supply ran low. But poison testing was almost merciful compared to the medical experimentation. Byzantine physicians seeking to understand human anatomy, test surgical procedures, or investigate disease progression required subjects for study. Using citizens risked scandal. Using slaves required compensation to their owners. Concubines, legally non-existent and politically invisible, provided perfect research material. A medical text preserved in the monastery library at Mount Athos, written by physician Paulos of Aegina, describes procedures performed on concubines with chilling detachment to understand the female reproductive capacity for multiple births. We examine the womb of a concubine who had borne 3 sets of twins, the dissection revealed. The text continues for 17 pages, describing in precise detail the vivisection of a woman who was almost certainly alive when the procedure began. As later passages discuss, the subject's responses to various stimuli before expiration occurred. These were not isolated incidents. Archaeological excavations beneath the palace complex uncovered a chamber containing the remains of at least 63 women, showing evidence of systematic surgical intervention, bones with saw marks indicating amputation skulls, with holes drilled in precise patterns suggesting brain access, pelvic bones separated in ways that could only have occurred through deliberate dissection. DNA analysis confirmed these remains, dated to the 10th and 11th centuries, precisely the period when Byzantine medical texts describe extensive anatomical research. The women were between 14 and 26 years old at death, and they were buried without ceremony in a mass grave beneath the very palace where they had been kept as living tools for imperial convenience. The cruelty did not end there. Before we uncover what happened to those few who attempted resistance, a moment if stories like these matter to you, if you believe the forgotten deserve remembrance, not as footnotes but as full human beings whose suffering shaped our world. Subscribing helps. It signals that these histories deserve telling without comfort or sanitization. Now, back to the women who had no choice but to endure the unbearable. Escape attempts were rare. The underground architecture made them nearly impossible, but desperation occasionally overwhelmed fear. Palace security records document 41 escape attempts over a 120-year period, roughly one every 3 years. The methods varied. Some tried to slip away during escorted bathing rituals. Others climbed ventilation shafts. A few hid in laundry carts leaving the complex. None succeeded. Recapture protocols were not designed merely to retrieve women, but to extinguish the idea of escape itself. When Concubine 37 was recaptured in 1034 after hiding in a food cart for nearly 6 hours, the longest any woman remained free, her punishment became spectacle. She was brought into the courtyard where all concubines were forced to watch. Guards stripped her naked. Iron implements were heated until they glowed red, then pressed into her skin, breasts, stomach, thighs, each brand accompanied by shouted questions. Do you reject the emperor's generosity? Do you refuse the honor granted your unworthy flesh? She was chained to a post for 3 days without food or water. Palace physicians deliberately left her burns untreated. She died on the 3rd day. Her body remained on display for another week, a rotting warning, visible to all. But some found other ways to resist. In cells where speech was forbidden and isolation enforced, women created methods the eunuchs never fully suppressed. Messages were scratched into stone with pottery shards, or fingernails worn to blood. Codes were tapped through shared walls, names, warnings, prayers. Tiny alterations were stitched into silk garments. Nearly invisible marks carry meaning to those who knew how to read them. Excavations uncovered hundreds of carvings. Most were simple. Maria was here, 17 years old, God remember me. Others revealed organization. One cell contained a scratched lunar calendar, evidence women secretly tracked fertility, attempting to avoid conception in defiance of breeding protocols. Another chamber revealed what was first mistaken for decoration, but later identified as a rough map and outline of the underground layout, guard routes, shift changes, escape paths. It was never used. Perhaps its creator died before trying. Perhaps it was left as a gift, proof that someone before had searched for a way out. The most devastating discovery came in 2007. Beneath a loose floor stone, archaeologists found a small carved wooden figure, a baby. Crude, improvised, undeniable. The wood dated to the mid-11th century. A woman who bore a child and never knew its fate had carved something to hold in the dark. She hid it carefully. Even this would have meant severe punishment if discovered, but she needed proof she had been a mother, if only for a moment. The resistance was small, fragile, ultimately futile, but it existed. When the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople in 1204, soldiers entered the concubine quarters and recoiled. Multiple chronicles describe men refusing to proceed once the conditions became clear. The chambers were sealed, forgotten, until centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered the cells, iron rings, mass graves, and desperate messages carved by women whose names were erased but whose testimony survived in stone. The Byzantine Empire fell in 1453. The palace was dismantled, looted, transformed, but the underground remained. Researchers now document what the empire tried to bury: chemical traces of human blood, bones showing systematic violence, carved words whispering across centuries. We were here. We suffered. We mattered. The sites are preserved, not celebrated, not advertised. Small bronze plaques mark where cells once held teenage girls, erased from records but not from stone. These women were not wives protected by marriage law, not prostitutes granted recognition, not slaves afforded limited legal status. They existed in a category designed for maximum extraction and minimum humanity: used, bred, experimented on, and discarded without consequence. They bore children taken from them, absorbed poisons meant for emperors, endured medical experiments that should have killed them sooner, and when they resisted, they were crushed so thoroughly that hope itself was meant to die with them. If their story reached you tonight, say which moment will stay with you longest. These women left no monuments. Only scratched stone, DNA, and bone testify to suffering buried beneath imperial grandeur and Christian piety. They deserved better than erasure. The least we can offer now is refusal to look away. They were here, they endured, and now finally we see